Hello and welcome to The Swing of Things. This episode is brought to you by our newest partner, CrewLab. CrewLab is a team management platform that provides a suite of digital tools to level up your team. U.S. Rowing members can enjoy a free extended trial and discount by going to crewlab.io/US Rowing. We are very excited to bring you this extra special episode. My guest today is the New York Times best-selling author Daniel James Brown. Brown is the author of The Boys in the Boat, which has been adapted for the silver screen and was directed by George Clooney and is every rower's must-watch movie this holiday season. For anyone who isn't familiar with The Boys in the Boat, it is an inspirational true story of Joe Rance and the Depression-era University of Washington crew, a boat that overcame many obstacles to race for the United States and a shot at the Olympic gold medal at Hitler's 1936 Games in Berlin. Hi, Daniel. It's so nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm such a big fan of your book. I have not yet seen the movie, but excited about that as well. So thank you in advance for taking some time with U.S. Rowing today.
Oh, it's very much my pleasure.
This podcast, The Swing of Things, it's for the rowing community. That's mostly what our audience, we have an audience of rowers, and you can imagine most of our listeners have read your book, but if there happen to be a few out there who haven't, can you give a quick description of the story and how you came to meet Joe Rance and decide to write this book?
So I knew nothing about rowing when this all started, which was about 13 years ago now. But my neighbor came to me, and she'd been reading one of my earlier books to her father, and he wanted to meet me. So I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. I think it was the next day. And Joe was ill. He was actually in the last couple months of his life, but he was living at his daughter's house. And we talked briefly about that other book. And then he began to talk about his days rowing back in the 1930s and how he and his crewmates had come together as a crew and wound up rowing in Germany at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin against a German and Italian boats and won the gold medal. He also had a very, very compelling personal story about how he was brought up during the Depression, and that really affected me too. But it really all started with those first conversations I had with Joe Rance quite a while ago now.
When speaking about Boys in the Boat, you've described how it's a story about who we are when we are at our best and when we endeavor to do something in common. When did this idea become apparent to you? Did you know it when you first met Joe in those first conversations? Was it through speaking with crew members and their families, or maybe learning about the sport of rowing in general? When did that become apparent to you?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a process as I was researching the book. I mean, one of the things that happened was Joe's daughter, Judy, introduced me to the family members of most of the other guys who'd rowed in that boat. And as I got to know them and as I began to learn more about the sport, it just sort of slowly dawned on me the extent to which the experience was a bonding experience and the extent to which rowing is really all about the other people in the boat as much as about yourself. And so it was really just sort of a series of revelations about Joe's journey from being a very, very individualistic individual, determined to take care of himself his own way, to ultimately becoming a great member of a great crew. And so, I don't know exactly at what point it all clicked for me, but by the time I was well into writing the book, I really realized that was what the story was all about. And I think this really resonated with a lot of people, not just in the rowing community, although certainly rowers were the first people to pick the book up, but obviously it's resonated well beyond that community.
Yeah, I always say to people, to rowers or non-rowers rather, I always say, you don't even need to like rowing or care about rowing. It's not really about rowing. It's about so much more. So You've spoken about how Joe would tear up whenever he thought of the boys he rode with, not for their loss, because most were no longer alive, I think, when you spoke with him.
That's right.
But for the sheer beauty of what they had done together. That's how you describe it. And how did this emotional connection impact your motivation to write the story? And why did Joe insist on writing about all of the boys in the boat?
Yeah, I mean, Joe was very firm about that. The day I asked him if I could write his story, he first thing he said was, "No, I don't want you writing about me." But then he turned right around and he said, "But you could write a book about the boat." And, I didn't know what he meant at first. I thought he meant the shell. So there was emotion right from the beginning for me, for him, and for Judy, his daughter. I mean, I wound up spending probably several hundred hours with his daughter after Joe passed away, because she had kept voluminous records of his story. She'd spent the last several years of his life sort of gathering bits and pieces of his story. And every time I talked to Judy, she wound up in tears. Sometimes I wound up in tears. It was just so, particularly the part of the story about his hardships growing up during the Depression were really, really touching to me. But it transcended that. It was also about just the emotional experience of bonding with these other guys. And then, of course, ultimately late in life, having to say goodbye to them one by one. So there was a lot of emotion through the whole process of researching the book and writing it.
Yeah, and having this conversation with him during really I didn't realize it was the last couple of months of his life.
Yeah, I think it was actually like the last 6 weeks of his life. So I was only able to talk to him directly a few times before he was just too ill. But as I say, what made the difference was that Judy, his daughter, was absolutely determined to save his story, and that's why she ultimately came to me. When she asked me down to her house, I didn't realize she, in the back of her mind, was thinking about maybe this is a guy who could write my dad's story for me. So,
was she thinking that? Do you think she was?
She was.
Oh, okay, so she was. Okay.
I didn't realize that at the time. But
under the guise of my dying father would love to meet you.
Yeah.
Clever woman. Well, that worked out.
Yeah.
In 2013, I think that's when you were on the first book tour. At one of your stops in Washington, D.C., you mentioned experiencing a series of revelations during the process of researching the book and writing. One discovery you described was the improbability of these working class kids from Washington achieving what they did, in contrast to the very wealthy Ivy League rowers. How did the socioeconomic disparity play out in the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, so that really struck me as I was doing that research, and I learned about each of these guys from the Washington crew. I mean, they virtually all came from very hard circumstances. And when I was reading, a lot of the research was actually reading press clippings from Eastern newspapers as well as Western newspapers. And the disparity, sort of in backgrounds became very evident to me very early on. And also talking to the families. And it was a big deal in Seattle. Seattle, in many ways, was not on the map in all kinds of ways in the 1930s. And so the whole town was eager to embrace anything that helped put Seattle on the map, particularly in regards to the East Coast. So that became part of the sort of the springboard and the motivation for these guys at Washington. They wanted to show the rowing establishment, which was mostly based on the East Coast, that these Westerners can row too, and Cal and Washington especially. So it became sort of, one of the engines of the narrative was this sort of tension between the worlds of the West Coast kids, particularly Washington, versus the worlds from which a lot of the East Coast kids had come.
So our audience is primarily rowers, as I said, and many of us as rowers have been lucky enough to have the experience of that, perfect row or the flat water in the morning with the fog not yet burned off and the sun rising, which you really capture so beautifully in your book. How did Pocock's influence on the boys and his own narrative contribute to this overarching theme of aspiring for something beyond individual pursuits, highlighting the beauty and really almost the spiritual nature of rowing when executed with excellence? I mean, you captured that so well, and Pocock plays a role in that. How did you even come to discover that, his role?
So that was one of the big revelations for me as I was digging into the story. You know, when I was first talking to Judy about the story and to Joe, they kept mentioning this guy named Pocock who built boats, and I thought, okay, well, whatever. He built boats. But then I started reading press accounts here in the Seattle Times and the Seattle PI about Pocock, and I read his book, his narrative of his life, and mostly was talking to other now old men, because it was men that he was coaching and dealing with, about their experiences back in the 30s and the 40s working with Pocock. And it was just very obvious. They had this kind of reverence for him that was hard to put into words, frankly. And it did. It revolved around a sort of spiritual dimension that Pocock, he was such an inspirational figure for these generations of rowers from Washington especially, who just looked up to him, not just for his, what he knew about rowing, which was a great deal, but for his sort of attitude towards life and to his attitude towards the sport. So, he taught them sort of to lift themselves up, to make themselves better, to transcend their ordinary selves by becoming part of something larger than themselves. And that to him, and he was very explicit about this, that was like almost approaching the divine. It was a deeply spiritually rewarding thing to experience this kind of bonding with others and to strive for something as audacious as they were striving for. So he's just, I wound up, this was actually Judy's suggestion. I wove Pocock into the narrative that I was telling in many places, but I also, Judy suggested that we start each chapter with a little quote from Pocock, because he had a way with words and he had all these little sort of pithy, inspirational things that he said along the way. And so we did that. We wound up putting at the beginning of every chapter a little quote from Pocock that somehow related to the contents of that chapter. And it was, I think, a very good idea, because it sort of creates this feeling that Pocock's spirit is hanging over the whole story. If every chapter you start with a little bit of Pocock and then you go on into the narrative. So anyway, Pocock was just fascinating to me.
You often describe the physical and mental hardships of rowing. You really captured that very well, too. And in a book talk, you compared this effort they expended to 2 NBA games played back-to-back in just 6 minutes, which sounds about right. How did the boys' ability to endure these challenges contribute to the overall narrative of the book?
Yeah, another revelation for me as I was writing the book was I started reading some of the physiology involved in rowing and, just the extraordinary toll that the sport takes on the body and the kind of condition you have to be in, particularly to race, at the level we're talking about here, an Olympic race, international race. So I've read lots of statistics and facts that kind of blew me away about the physical requirements of the sport. And I can't say that I've ever experienced it myself. I've been in a boat a few times, but nothing that I've done could even be called rowing. It was more like flailing about with an oar.
That was one of my questions: is did you learn to row to write this book, or
not really? But one of the first glimpses I got into how hard it is shortly after I decided to write the book. I went down to the modern University of Washington shell house, Conover Shell House, and I met some of the coaches down there. And the freshman coach, Luke McGee, put me in a launch and took me out early one very cold, I think it was a February morning. And we were out there sort of going back and forth with the guys, the freshman crews. And I mean, I was sitting in a boat all bundled up in parkas and a life vest and all that stuff. And I thought I'd die out there just from the cold.
Just in the launch.
Butt down in the water. And it's just like, and these guys were all just, red in the face and going and going and going and going. And then finally we came in and they immediately all filed into the erg, sat down and started pulling on the erg machines. And I was like, really? After all that, you're going to sit down at these machines? So it was a very early, very graphic demonstration for me of how demanding this sport is.
Well, this tells you how small the rowing world is. I've heard about that launch ride from Luke McGee's wife.
Okay.
Yes, that was her connection to Boys in the Boat. And yeah, I love that was your one of your first tastes of the sport. Yeah, and even being in the launch, not easy. It's cold and you don't warm up.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the aspects of the story is because this crew was based here in Seattle. Where, the good news is they can row all winter long, but the bad news is they can row all winter long too. And so, many times I've been driving over the bridge into Seattle and seen those guys and the women also out there, in sleet and snow. And it's tough stuff.
It sort of toughens you up for the rest of your life, though. Yeah. Nothing seems that bad after that.
I've heard many people say that, and I think that's true.
So, speaking of rowers, what's some of the most memorable feedback or reactions you've received from the rowing community about the book, and any surprises, or was it sort of what you expected?
I think in the years after the book came out, I was touring the country for quite a while, doing book talks, and I met a lot of rowers. And I don't want to overstate this, but I came to feel as there's a certain sort of set of core values and attitudes that rowers have that, as you were just saying, sort of prepare them for the rest of life. And I talked to a lot of older men and women who'd been very successful in their careers. I mean, very, very successful in some cases, who attributed to the fact that they'd done well in their careers to the times when they rowed back in the 50s or the 40s or in some cases in the 30s. So, that was, again, another sort of revelation to me, a surprise to me. That and the fact that, again, when I talked to these folks, even who hadn't been rowing for decades in some cases or hadn't been rowing competitively, they would often tear up when they started to talk about their rowing experiences. So, again, it just sort of impressed on me the emotion that the sport brings out. Why do you think,
having spent so much time researching this sport and writing about it, why do you think they teared up?
I've been trying to sort of figure that out since the book came out. One of the very first things that happened when the book came out was I started getting emails, and also I was looking at Amazon reviews of the book to see what people were thinking of it. And people kept, it seemed like it was especially men, kept telling me in emails or in their reviews that they had teared up while reading the book. And as I say, I've not done the sport myself, so I can't, speak firsthand. But I think it's a combination of remembering that time in their lives that, has passed away, remembering the people, the men or the women that they rowed with, who in many cases have passed away. But also often they're tears of joy. I mean, just remembering how good it felt and how rewarding the experience was. It really does bring up these, not just tears, but a lot of emotion. And I think it's that. I think it's just casting their minds back to those times and feeling both pride for what they did and joy in what they did, and also often some sadness about the fact that that's in the past now.
Yeah, I think that sounds accurate. Over the past decade, Boys in the Boat has transformed into a bestseller, and the upcoming movie release this Christmas. Has your perspective and your connection to Joe's story and all of the boys' story, the boys in the boat, evolved at all? It's been a decade. If there have been changes, can you elaborate on the impact and how it has influenced your thoughts?
It's just really been this gradual process of coming to appreciate, first of all, a lot of gratitude for how well the book's been received. I mean, it's very seldom that, well, it's not good. A lot of writers struggle very hard, work very hard, and don't have this level of success in terms of appealing to an audience. So I'm full of gratitude for that. But I have also very slowly internalized for myself some of the sort of life lessons of the book, and it's helped me get through a few hard times myself, just sort of gutting it out and being grateful for what I have. And so I think it's been a teaching thing for some of my readers, but it's also been a teaching thing for me. And aside from, the success of the book, I think the great reward for me has been just learning about what these guys did, what they went through, how much they loved each other, how that changed their lives. It just helps me keep my own problems in perspective. And that's a gift that I couldn't have gotten really if Judy hadn't come that day and asked me to come meet her father. None of that would have happened. So again, it's just a sort of cumulative thing where I feel more deeply appreciative than ever of just having had the opportunity to tell the story.
Yeah, we often talk about how rowing is the ultimate team sport. And I mean, of course, we're all biased here at U.S.
Sure.
Rowing, or people leading rowing organizations or coaching. And we think that, it has some sort of edge. And I personally think that it has all these life lessons it teaches so naturally about patience and teamwork and, no superstars in the boat and balance and patience and being coachable. Do you think it has, an edge over other sports? And if so, why? In terms of teaching lessons.
Yeah, I mean, I do. And I think it's those things that you just ticked through. I mean, I'm a fan of football and baseball and basketball. I follow a lot of different sports and admire the stars like other fans. But I do think rowing is unique in the extent to which it's about teamwork. I mean, all teams are by definition teams. But there's something about rowing, and I guess it's partly the mechanics of it, the absolute need to be perfectly synchronized with one another, the absolute need to make sure that everybody else in the boat is doing the right thing at the right moment, and that you're responsible for other people in the boat every time with every stroke. That's fundamentally different than basketball, for instance, or any other team sport that I can think of. It's just maybe just a different level of teamwork that I'm not aware of any other sport that demands and teaches teamwork on the same level that rowing does. And this was very much true in the 1936 gold medal crew. They really, the day of the gold medal race, Coach Ulbrichtson wasn't going to put Don Hume in the boat because he had a respiratory illness of some kind. Very uncharacteristically, the rest of the guys went to Ulbrichtson that morning and basically said, he has to be in the boat. He's going to be in the boat. And Ulbrichtson was a hard guy to stare down. And I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly what the confrontation looked like. But these guys were not going to come all the way to Berlin, row for a gold medal, and leave one of their guys standing on the shore watching it. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the story.
I knew you'd have a good answer for that. What makes it unique?
Yeah.
And have you ever watched rowing from the beginning? Like a brand new boat of rowers who'd never been in an 8 before or 4?
No, I haven't, but I imagine it's informative.
It really is. It really is, because you can see, people who say it's poetry in motion, but it's really, when you first put 9 people in, let's say, an 8. It's not poetry in motion. It's, I always say it's like airport, trashy airport novels in motion. It's messy and it's not coordinated, and it's kind of fun to see where it starts.
I can tell you a little story actually related to the movie because Clooney just told it himself recently. When they hired the actors to play the rowers, the 36 crew in the film, none of them, of course, knew anything about rowing at all. So they put them through 6 weeks of intensive training. They had an Olympic coach whose name, I'm sorry, I can't remember at the moment. But they really went at it very, very seriously. But after several weeks, George Clooney and Grant Heslov, the producers, came down to see how they were doing. And they were just oars flying every which way. And and they said, oh, my God, what are we going to do? We're all set up to shoot these guys,
This does not look like Olympians.
They did not look like Olympic rowers at that point. So that was about halfway through the training. Fortunately, by the time the training was over, they could, they're not Olympic rowers, they're actors, but they could row reasonably well. And, we'll see what rowers think of the form and technique when the movie comes out. It looked good to me, but I'm not going to prejudge that.
Did you ever imagine when you wrote this book that George Clooney would one day be making it into a movie?
I didn't. Actually, I did think it would be made into, or I thought it might be made into a movie. I had no idea who would make it. But the day after we sold the story to the book publisher, I started getting calls from Hollywood. And so we actually wound up selling the movie rights the day after we sold the book rights. So I knew, now rights to books get sold all the time to Hollywood, and a lot of them never do get made. But they were pretty keen on it right from the beginning. So I thought it probably would get made eventually. I didn't think it would take 10 years, but I was fairly optimistic all along.
Were you a part of the adaptation at all?
No, not really. They hired a screenwriter, as they should do, and they passed the script by me a couple times. I made some comments, but it's basically their show.
You weren't shoulder to shoulder with George Clooney, pointing out technique?
No, actually, I did wind up shoulder to shoulder with him recently. He and his wife and Grant Heslov, the other producer, invited me and my wife and a bunch of other people to come down to Hollywood and for a screening of the film back in August. So we went down to the Warner Brothers lot and sat down, and Clooney came over to us right away and he didn't have to introduce himself. I knew who he was.
Yeah.
But we had a good long chat before the screening, and then he came right back to me after the screening to see what I thought of it. And so we had some really good discussions. Very much to his credit, I think, I had talked to him on the phone right after he decided to sign on as director. One of the things he did was call me and talk to me about how he wanted to approach the story, and I was impressed. It was very obvious that he had read the book, not just read it, but really understood it, understood the spirit of it. He talked about the fact that we think of him, as ultra rich and a megastar, but he actually grew up relatively poor in Kentucky, and he talked quite a bit about how that helped him empathize with these guys, particularly the Joe Rance story. So I had a really good feeling after that initial conversation that the spirit of the story, at least, would come through in the film, and I think it does.
Well, I so appreciate the time today and talking about your book and what is now a movie. And I can say the rowing community is incredibly excited about your story. Well, Joe's story, Joe and the boys' story that you so beautifully put into words, now becoming a film. And thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun.
And that's all for this episode of The Swing of Things. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to like, share, and follow from wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others to find us. Please subscribe to make sure you don't miss future episodes. And thanks for listening.